Hearts and Coronets is a 1949 British crime black comedy film directed by Robert Harmer. It features Dennis Price, Joan Greenwood, Valerie Hobson and Alec Guinness. Guinness plays 8 characters. Set in Edwardian England, the film opens on Louis de Gascoigne Mazzini, 10th Duke of Chalfont, in prison awaiting his hanging for murder, to be carried out the following morning. He writes an account of the events that led him to this point, which forms the basis of the narration of the film told in flashback. His mother, the youngest daughter of the 7th Duke of Chalfont, eloped with an Italian opera singer named Mazzini and was subsequently disowned by her family. The Mazzinis were poor but happy until Mazzini died shortly after Louis was born. Louis's mother, bringing him up among stories of the history of her family, and tells him how, unlike most other peerages, the Dukedom of Chelmsford can descend through the female as well as male heirs. Louis's only childhood friends are Sibella Hallward and her brother. When Louis leaves school, his mother writes to her kinsman, Lord Ascon de Gascoigne, head of a private bank, for assistance in launching her son's career, but is rebuffed. Louis is forced to work as an assistant to a draper. When his mother dies, a vengeful Louis decides to take the family's dukedom by murdering the 8 people ahead of him in the line of succession. After arranging a fatal boating accident for Ascon de Gascoigne and his mistress, Louis writes a letter of condolence to the victim's father, Lord Ascon de Gascoigne, who employs him as a clerk. Upon his later promotion, Louis takes a bachelor pad in St. James's, London, for assignations with Sibella, who is unhappy in her marriage to the dull Lionel. Louis's next target, Henry de Gascoigne, a keen amateur photographer. He meets Henry and is charmed by his wife, Edith. He substitutes petrol for paraffin in the lamp in Henry's dark room, with fatal results, and later decides that Edith is fit to be his Duchess. The Reverend Lord Henry de Gascoigne is the next victim, and Louis, posing as Bishop of Metabeleland, poisoned Lord Henry's after-dinner port. From the window of his flat, Louis then uses a bow and arrow to shoot down the balloon of which the suffragette Lady Agatha de Gascoigne is dropping leaflets over London. Admiral Lord Horatio de Gascoigne presents a challenge as he rarely sets foot on land. However, by chance, he conveniently insists on going down with his ship after causing a collision at sea, and is the only family death not part of Louis's scheme. Next sends General Lord Rufus de Gascoigne a jar of caviar which contains a bomb. When Edith agrees to marry Louis, they notify Ethelred, the childless widowed 8th Duke. He invites them to spend a few days at Chalfont Castle. When Ethelred casually informs Louis that he intends to remarry in order to produce an heir, Louis arranges a hunting accident. Before shooting the Duke, he reveals his motive. Lord Ascon de Gascoigne dies from the shock of learning that he has become the 9th Duke, sparing Louis from having to murder his kindly employer. Louis inherits the dukedom, but his triumph is proved short-lived. Sibella's husband Lionel had made a drunken plea to Louis for financial help to avoid bankruptcy, but Louis turned him down. Lionel is later found dead, and Scotland Yard detectives arrest Louis, suspicion of murder. Louis elects to be tried by his peers in the House of Lords. During the trial, Louis and Edith are married. Sibella falsely testifies that Lionel was about to seek a divorce and names Louis as co-respondent, and that no suicide note was found. Ironically, Louis is convicted of a murder he had never ever contemplated. Louis is visited by Sibella, who observes that the belated discovery of Lionel's suicide note, together with Louis's promise to dispose of Edith, would free Louis and enable them to marry, a proposal to which, facing the gallows, he is forced to agree. Moments before his hanging, the discovery of the note secures his release. Louis finds both Edith and Sibella waiting for him outside the prison. Before Louis can decide which to choose, a reporter approaches him to inform him that his magazine wishes to publish his memoirs. Louis suddenly remembers the memoir he has already written for the narration of his crimes, which he has inadvertently left behind in his cell. Thus, having escaped punishment for a crime he was convicted of that he did not commit, he realizes he has written a full confession of crimes that he was not tried for, which he did commit. Does it hold up today? In that simple, very British, general, upper-class way, yes. It's very much a British film first and foremost, and timeless in that it was a period piece when it was created, and like anything set back from when the time it was made, instinctively retains a timeless quality. Shot in black and white, which helps to lend a feeling of history about it, and in the 1:37:1 aspect ratio. The story is largely a succession of quick-witted, very dark gallows humour and a vinway of short murder stories threaded together by Price's narration. Although not all are speaking parts or large roles to play, Alex Guinness's performance is a masterclass in character study, any aspiring actor would do well to watch. As although obviously as it's one man there is a resemblance between the characters as much as there would be in a real family, but despite what would at first appear to be a limitation, Guinness is able to create sufficient separate characteristics, expressions and mannerisms for each individual character that after a short while you forget that it is one actor playing all the family roles, and rather that it could be a group of 5 or more brothers playing all the roles. The moral of manners is what makes this comedy work so well, and why it can only really be described as a quintessential British picture. The women turn a wonderful performance too. Hobson as the uptight, moralistic Edith, and Greenwood as the immoral, scheming, social climate Sibella, are perfectly cast foils for Price's more pragmatic Lewis, that you begin to feel by the end, when he has to choose which coach to climb into, had he not been a murderer and yet had still arrived where he was, Greenwood would still have engineered it so that he would have been in jail for her husband's murder, so that she could have manoeuvred herself to become the 10th Duke's new Duchess. So if you're a fan of dark black comedy and the absurdity of the British class system and want to indulge yourself in a true classical gem, this comedy is certainly the large diamond in the tiara you'll be looking for.